You feel the weight, even when you can't explain it. There's something there, a strange presence in the mind, as if fear had found a hidden corner to live in. And no matter how much you try to distract yourself, to stay busy, to move on, it returns. Not with screams, but with whispers that empty the chest. Have you ever faced fears like that? The kind no one sees, that even you can't understand, yet they linger, silent, insistent. Not every fear has a name. Sometimes it disguises itself as fatigue, impatience, or racing thoughts. It doesn't show up on exams, it can't be solved by logic, and it doesn't fade with advice. It just settles in, slowly dimming the light inside. And the hardest part is when you feel all of this, and still keep smiling on the outside, pretending everything is fine, because it's a fear only you can hear. That's where grace begins to move. Not with noise, not with visible miracles, but with presence. God is not afraid of the fears you can't explain. He doesn't wait for you to understand everything before he acts. He steps in right where you get lost. The shield of God doesn't make noise, but it covers. It's not made of iron, but of faithfulness. And it's in that silence that he works, in the space between what you feel and what you can't put into words. Many think divine protection is something spectacular, lightning, rescues, open doors. But there's a form of care that only those who have walked through the valley understand. The quiet shelter, the one that doesn't stop fear from appearing, but keeps it from winning. It's the invisible shield that stands between you and the fall. And sometimes you didn't even realize you were protected all along until you looked back. Maybe you're at that point right now, trying to deal with what you feel without knowing where to start. And that's okay. What this video will show you is that faith doesn't need to be loud to be strong. God doesn't need to explain everything to prove he's present. And your fears, even the deepest ones, have no power to pass through what he has already placed between you. Let's walk through this together. Let's look to Scripture, to the ways God moves in silence, and rediscover how to trust him even when the heart can't understand. You don't have to overcome this fear alone, because you were never alone. Embrace this moment, breathe deeply, let the shield reveal itself slowly, because maybe the greatest proof that God is protecting you is the simple fact that you haven't fallen apart, even without knowing how to keep going. There are fears that don't scream. They simply take a deep breath inside the soul, like a cold wind slipping through doors left slightly open. They are fears no one sees. The fear of failing, of being forgotten, of never being enough. They don't show up in tears or words, but in long silences and tired smiles. And the hardest part is that often the one who feels them doesn't even know where they come from. They just feel the chest tighten, the thoughts repeat, and hope hide behind the clouds. Have you ever felt fear without knowing exactly why? Sometimes it shows up in the middle of routine, when everything seems normal. It comes disguised as worry, mild anxiety, the constant thought that you have to handle everything. But behind that effort is a tired soul trying not to collapse. This is the kind of fear that doesn't destroy all at once. It wears you down slowly until faith starts to seem smaller than it really is. The Bible says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. He who fears has not been made perfect in love." 1 John 4:18. This truth transcends time. God's love is the force that drives out fear, not by force, but by presence. Where love abides, fear loses the space it once occupied. And that love isn't a distant concept. It's a presence that surrounds you, a shield that covers even what cannot be named. But the enemy tries to wage this war in silence. He doesn't arrive with noise, but with doubts. He doesn't use visible weapons, but subtle thoughts. And when the mind is tired, it begins to believe it's alone. That's when fear grows. Not because it's strong, but because it sounds like the only voice speaking. That's why God doesn't just fight fear. He silences it with love. He becomes the calmest voice within the storm of the mind. Imagine a soldier without armor trying to fight invisible enemies. That's what a heart without rest in God is like. It fights, but grows weary. It runs, but never arrives. And when everything feels directionless, God offers something better than strength. He offers shelter. He doesn't demand immediate courage, only enough trust to remain in the hiding place of His presence. Fear feeds on the unknown, but faith grows in it. It's in the soil of uncertainty that God's love proves itself real. When night falls and the heart feels lost, that's where the shield reveals itself, not as a wall, but as arms, not as resistance, but as refuge. And even when you feel nothing, something is still happening. Because the invisible war doesn't end when fear grows silent. It ends when the soul finds rest. And that rest comes only when you realize that God protects even what the mind cannot comprehend. Sometimes silence isn't absence. It's the sound of the shield being raised around the heart. And that's the moment the next step begins, when God protects even what we don't yet know how to name. There are pains that even the soul cannot describe. They are inner pressures that appear on calm days, thoughts that return without reason, anguish with no clear origin. In those moments, many believe that God only acts when things are visible, when there's a clear prayer, a specific request, a defined cause. But the truth is, He also works in what's still unclear. Grace reaches the corners of the soul that don't even know how to cry for help. God doesn't wait for you to find the words to understand what you feel. Before fear takes shape, He already knows it completely. Before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. Psalm 139:4. This is proof that divine care doesn't depend on human clarity. Even when the heart can't express itself, He interprets the silence, translates the tears, understands what even you don't. There's deep comfort in knowing that God doesn't need explanations. He moves through compassion, not information. When you merely sigh, He already feels the weight of that sigh. When you close your eyes and try just to breathe, He's already there, sustaining the very air that enters. That divine sensitivity makes His presence unlike any other, protection that precedes danger, love that acts before fear takes form. Many try to protect themselves with reasoning, planning, and control. They think that if they can understand fear, they can defeat it. But there are fears that only cease when they're surrendered, not when they're explained. God guards the places where the mind cannot reach. He doesn't need you to have all the answers, only a heart willing to trust, even if it trembles. That's the beauty of faith. It doesn't require emotional perfection. It blooms right where reason grows silent. When the soul is too tired to pray, the Spirit prays for it. When fear has no name, grace calls it by its true one, peace. There's a strength working in the shadows of thought, and it doesn't come from human effort, but from divine faithfulness. Think of how many times you were on the verge of breaking, and somehow you stayed standing. It wasn't coincidence. It was care. It wasn't luck. It was silent protection, because God doesn't just act in what's visible. He stands guard where fear is still being formed. His presence doesn't depend on awareness. It's constant, unbroken, faithful. And when you finally realize you've been protected all along, something shifts. Fear loses its shape, the soul exhales, and the heart begins to rest again. Because God doesn't just protect what the world can see. He covers even what your own soul cannot name. And in that quiet shelter, the true power of His presence begins to unfold, the shield that makes no sound, yet holds up everything that was about to fall. Most shields the world knows make noise. They're made of iron, raised with strength, clashing against blows. But God's shield doesn't follow that logic. It is silent, made not of metal, but of mercy. Its power isn't in the sound of impact, but in the softness of presence. It's the kind of shield that doesn't stop the wind from blowing, but keeps it from destroying. And the most beautiful part is that often the soul only realizes how protected it was after the storm has passed. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. Psalm 91:4. This image is gentle yet powerful. It doesn't speak of walls or weapons, but of shelter. The wings of God make no noise, yet they surround you. They symbolize care, not confrontation. They remind us that divine protection isn't always visible, but it's always constant, a spiritual covering stretched over the heart, even when it doubts. Some mistake the absence of noise for the absence of action. They think that if God were truly moving, something spectacular would happen. But he rarely works through spectacle. His ways are almost always quiet, woven into details, small shifts that only those who watch closely can perceive. Faith, therefore, is not only believing that God will act, it's trusting that he already is, even when you can't yet hear the sound of it. Think of how many times you prayed and nothing seemed to change. How many nights you went to bed feeling the same weight, and yet the sun rose again. You breathed, you stood, you kept going. That's grace, the shield that makes no sound but keeps you from falling. God's faithfulness doesn't need to announce itself. It manifests through consistency. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that unchanging nature is what makes him the safest refuge of all. His presence isn't harsh, it's gentle. It doesn't tear down walls. It rebuilds what was broken. It doesn't fight fear with fear, but offers peace to the heart. It's the kind of defense that wins not through force, but through the steadiness of love. When the enemy throws invisible darts, the shield of faith extinguishes them one by one, not with noise, but with truth. That's why many people don't realize they're being guarded. They expect thunder, but God speaks in a whisper. They wait for a visible answer, but he offers presence. And it's precisely that presence that neutralizes fear, because when the soul knows it's not alone, fear loses its right to stay. Maybe right now you can't feel anything, but know this: silence isn't emptiness. It's the space where God works. And in that space, he begins transforming fear into rest, preparing the mind to understand that the real battle happens within. And it's there that the next step is revealed. Most of the battles we fight don't happen outside. They happen in the mind. It's there that fear forms, feeds, and grows stronger. Before it's an emotion, fear is a repeated thought, a distorted image that the mind keeps replaying. That's why the enemy invests so much in mental territory, because he knows that once he wins there, the rest begins to crumble. The mind becomes the field where faith either advances or retreats. The Word of God warns us, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2. This renewal isn't a single event, it's a process. It's allowing God to replace fearful thoughts with truthful ones, and that truth isn't optimistic, it's spiritual. It declares that God is still in control even when everything looks chaotic. Many Christians face invisible fears, not because they lack faith, but because their minds are too loud. The mind imagines disasters, anticipates pain that doesn't exist yet, and convinces the heart that something bad is about to happen. That's where God steps in, not just as comfort, but as commander. He offers not only peace, but direction, a new way of thinking that replaces panic with trust. When the mind is overtaken by fear, faith doesn't disappear. It just gets muffled. It's like a candle still burning in a strong wind. It's there, but it needs protection. Prayer, meditating on the Word, and stillness before God are ways to shelter that flame. They create room for His presence to rise above the anxious noise. Jesus knew this when He taught about daily worries. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Matthew 6:34. This isn't an order to ignore the future. It's an invitation to live in trust. Fear tries to live in tomorrow, but God always manifests in now. There's a difference between thinking and meditating. Thinking spins in circles of concern. Meditating rests the mind in God's presence. When the mind submits to the Spirit, fear loses ground. The war still happens, but control changes hands. And when that happens, even the silence of the soul begins to sound like victory. Maybe today your mind is tired of fighting thoughts that won't stop. Breathe, close your eyes and whisper, "Renew my mind, Lord." He will hear you, because no internal battle is too small for God to step into. He knows every thought that crosses your mind, and each one can be touched by His peace. And in that renewed space of the mind, fear begins to lose its command, and faith quietly takes back the place that was always hers. If this reflection is meeting you where you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribe and let these quiet words find you again. Some fears don't show up as despair, they hide in indecision. They're the ones that make a person wait for the perfect moment to act, the clear sign, the absolute certainty. But that moment never comes. The fear of loss, of failure, of rejection, all of it blends together until the soul grows used to standing still. And that's where fear wins without striking. It wins when it convinces the heart not to move. Fear paralyzes more than failure ever could. Mistakes still teach, but fear only delays. Many believers live trapped in the search for perfect safety, believing that faith and control can walk together. But faith isn't the absence of risk. It's the presence of trust. For we walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. To walk by faith is to move forward even when your feet tremble, to choose to believe even when the scene hasn't changed yet. Abraham was called to leave his homeland without knowing where he was going. Moses lifted his staff before the sea, trusting that God would open the way. Peter took his first step onto the water before the wind had ceased. In every one of these moments, fear was present, but it never had the final word. They didn't wait to feel brave, they moved because they trusted. And it's in that movement that faith breathes. When fear takes over, the heart starts to negotiate with time. Maybe later, when I'm ready, when God confirms it again. But time doesn't heal fear. Trust does. Every delayed step becomes spiritual distance. God doesn't just want you to understand His purpose, He wants you to live it. And living requires decision, even when the mind doesn't fully comprehend. There's a difference between prudence and paralysis. Prudence listens to God before acting. Paralysis listens to fear and calls it wisdom. Prudence is born from faith, fear from its absence. The enemy knows this. That's why he doesn't always destroy. He sometimes just convinces you to wait indefinitely. And when waiting isn't led by God, it becomes disguised avoidance. God never promised the absence of danger, but He guaranteed His constant presence. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, yes, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 41:10. That promise is the antidote to paralyzing fear because it doesn't rely on courage, it relies on presence. And His presence is enough to move even a weary heart. Faith isn't a race, it's a step. And each step taken in trust breaks down a piece of fear's fortress. Maybe you can't run yet, but that first small move is already victory. Because fear shouts for you to stop, but God whispers, just come. And when you respond to that whisper, you realize the road wasn't that long. It just needed to begin. And it's on that trembling path that something is revealed. Fear loses its power when it meets movement. And the next step in this journey shows how Jesus perceives even the fears that haven't yet been spoken. Jesus always noticed what the heart tried to hide. Even when the lips stayed silent, He could see the fear in His disciples' eyes. In many moments before panic became words, He was already offering peace. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. John 14:1. Those words weren't spoken to strangers, but to close friends, men who lived with the fear of loss, of failure, of not understanding what was unfolding. The disciples lived in the tension between faith and insecurity. They had seen miracles, yet they still trembled before uncertainty. The storm on the sea is a perfect image of that. The waves roared, the wind howled, and they cried out in fear, while Jesus slept. His presence didn't stop the storm, but it showed that fear didn't have to rule. When he rose and said, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" Mark 4:40. It wasn't a rebuke, it was an invitation. He was teaching that true faith isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to trust. Jesus never condemned those who were afraid. He simply showed that fear doesn't have to lead. When Peter began to sink after taking a few steps on the water, Christ's gaze reached him before he fell. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. The touch came before the correction. Salvation came before the lesson. That's grace, a hand that reaches out before the soul completely sinks. There's a deep tenderness in how Jesus handles human fear. He doesn't demand that you understand the unseen, only that you trust him within the uncertainty. Even when the disciples fled in the darkest hour, he went after them, called each by name, and restored them. Because grace isn't offended by fear, it redeems it. And it's still that way today. Jesus continues to notice the fears you don't confess. He sees when your smile tries to hide exhaustion, when your body shows up, but your mind has already given up. And still, he keeps saying, "Come with me." His voice doesn't compete with fear. It quiets it. It's the same tone that calmed the sea, the same one that lifted broken hearts. The presence of Jesus is the greatest antidote to fear, because where he enters, fear loses its reason to exist. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. John 14:27. That promise still echoes today. It doesn't guarantee a life without storms, but it assures his constant presence within them. When fear tries to whisper again, remember, he's still in the same boat. Even if he seems to be sleeping, he never left. The wind may blow, the waves may crash, but his word remains. And one word from him is enough to calm it all. And it's in that quiet confidence that we discover the next truth. God is not only the one who sees our inner battles. He becomes the shield that stands between us and them. Not every battle involves people. Some happen in silence, inside the mind and the heart. They are thoughts colliding, memories that weigh heavy, doubts that keep repeating. Invisible battles, fought in the late hours when the soul tries to rest but can't. And even then, God places himself between you and what threatens you. He becomes the shield, not only against visible enemies, but against the very emotions that try to consume you. The word says, "For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." Colossians 3:3. This isn't a poetic metaphor, it's a spiritual reality. Being hidden in God means living under a covering the world cannot understand. It means that even when fear tries to approach, it can't pass through the presence that surrounds you. God doesn't merely watch your inner struggles, he participates in them as an invisible shield that stops the blow from reaching where it would hurt the most. In the midst of the mind's battles, there are moments when the soul grows tired of resisting. The enemy whispers, "You won't make it." But the Holy Spirit answers, "You were never alone." This silent dialogue happens all the time, and it's there that the shield of God reveals itself. It doesn't only block external attacks, it stops destructive thoughts, memories of guilt, and voices of accusation. David knew this kind of protection. When he fled from Saul, he had no armies or weapons, only one certainty. "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me. my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. Psalm 3:3. That conviction kept him standing when fear tried to bring him down. His confidence wasn't in the absence of danger, but in the constancy of divine presence. And that same presence remains the refuge of every weary heart today. The shield of God doesn't erase pain, but it prevents it from destroying you. It doesn't stop the attack, but it stops the collapse. It's like standing in the middle of a storm and realizing that even though you're soaked, you're still standing. The wind may shake, but grace holds you. Fear may shout, but God's voice stays firm. I am here. That's what keeps the heart upright when the mind feels exhausted. When the soul begins to grasp this truth, it learns to rest even while the battle continues. Not because the conflict is over, but because it knows it no longer fights alone. The shield isn't outside, it's all around. It covers thoughts, guards emotions, and sustains the spirit. Fear may touch the surface, but never again the center, because the center is now hidden in Christ. And it's at that point of surrender that something new begins. When the heart admits it can't fight by its own strength, it becomes light enough to be carried. That's when the most powerful act of faith happens, to hand over what you feel, not fully understanding, but fully trusting. And that's exactly what the next step reveals, a simple yet deeply spiritual act, naming your fear before God and placing it in the hands that never fail. There are moments when the greatest act of faith isn't to fight, it's to surrender. Naming your fear before God is a simple gesture, yet profoundly transforming. It's acknowledging that what has chased you can no longer remain hidden. It's looking inward, recognizing what's been draining your peace, and placing it in the right hands. Fear doesn't always have a clear name, but when it's brought into God's presence, it loses the power to rule you in the dark. The word says, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. This verse isn't just an invitation, it's a compassionate command. It reminds us that God's care is active. He doesn't just observe, he sustains. When you cast something into his hands, it isn't merely symbolic, it's a spiritual act of surrender. The weight that was on you changes places, and when the burden changes hands, the heart begins to breathe again. Perhaps the fear that follows you doesn't even have a form. Maybe it shows up in restless nights, constant worries, that lingering sense of alertness. Even so, speak its name: loss, failure, loneliness, guilt, future. Say it quietly, even in thought, and release it. God doesn't need speeches. He understands sighs. Remember, the altar of surrender isn't a physical place. It can be the silence of your room, the drive to work, or a pause between tasks. What matters is sincerity. When fear is brought into the light, it loses the strength it had in the shadows. And it's in that sacred exposure that the Holy Spirit begins to work. Calming, healing, realigning. Fear doesn't dissolve because you understood it, but because you entrusted it. That's what faith does. It shifts the focus from what scares you to the one who guards you. This movement is invisible to the eyes, but visible to the heart. When the soul yields, the shield of God rises even higher. It covers, surrounds, and turns what was once a wound into a point of contact with grace. Many believe courage is the absence of fear, but it isn't. Courage is surrender. It's saying, Lord, I feel afraid, but I trust you anyway. And that's the phrase that moves heaven. Because God isn't impressed by fear, he responds to trust. And the sooner fear is named, the sooner it loses control. If you'd like, close your eyes now. Think of that fear. See it before God and simply say, it's in your hands. That's the act of surrender. Small in the eyes of the world, but mighty in the kingdom of heaven. And when the heart completes that offering, something changes. Fear may still exist, but it no longer commands, because now there's a shield between you and it, Christ himself. And after that silent surrender, a new kind of confidence begins to rise. a faith that blooms even in the shadows, upheld by the God who turns fear into maturity and silence into strength. If this speaks to your soul, walk with us, one quiet video at a time. Subscribe and let these reflections keep finding you when you need them most. Faith doesn't erase fear, it walks through it. Spiritual growth isn't about ceasing to feel, but learning to keep walking even while trembling. And there's something sacred about continuing to trust when the heart still hesitates, because it's in the dark that faith proves itself real. Light only confirms what already exists, but darkness refines it. When everything around feels uncertain, that's when the soul learns to trust not in what it sees, but in the one who sustains it. The psalmist wrote, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Psalm 23:4. This is one of the most profound declarations of trust ever spoken. David doesn't speak of escaping the valley, but of presence within it. He understood that the shadow isn't the end, it's the path. Confidence doesn't come from the absence of danger, but from the awareness of companionship. Sometimes the darkness is simply the place where God hides what is still growing. Like a seed buried in the soil, there are moments when the unseen becomes the ground of faith. Nothing seems to change, yet life is forming there. Every silent prayer, every tear offered in trust, every season of waiting, all of these are roots. And one day, what was once pain will bloom into testimony. The problem is that fear wants you to mistake silence for abandonment. It whispers, "God forgot you." But the truth is the opposite. Silence is the setting where he speaks the most. Only now, instead of answering with words, he answers with presence. And presence doesn't need sound, it just needs to be felt. Even when you can't perceive it, it's still holding every step. Trust in God matures when we stop demanding explanations and start resting in his faithfulness. When the heart learns that control is no longer necessary, fear loses its fuel. Control feeds fear. Surrender feeds faith. And when faith takes the wheel, even the dark road begins to look less frightening. Think of how many times you've looked back and realized that what seemed like an ending was really a disguised beginning, that what once terrified you became the very thing that drew you closer to God. Trust grows in those subtle memories, in the quiet evidence that even in the dark, you were never abandoned. Spiritual maturity isn't built on answers, but on endurance. Staying, even without understanding, is the purest form of faith, because while fear feeds on haste, trust grows in patience. And it's in that constancy that the heart learns what it truly means to rest in God. And it's in that quiet rest that the heart discovers a simple yet profound truth. God is not a shield of moments. He is the continuous refuge that remains, even when faith feels tired. Over time, the soul learns that not all protection can be seen. God doesn't act only in emergencies. He abides in the in-betweens. His shield doesn't rise only in great storms, but also in ordinary hours, on days when nothing happens, and yet the heart keeps beating. God's care is constant, even when life feels still. His silence isn't absence, it's invisible support. The psalmist declared, "You are my hiding place. You shall preserve me from trouble. You shall surround me with songs of deliverance." Psalm 32:7. This is the perfect image of divine constancy. A hiding place doesn't appear only when danger comes. It exists always, ready to receive. That's what a trusting heart is like. It doesn't wait for fear to knock before seeking shelter. It lives beneath the protective presence. There are moments when fear returns, even after being surrendered. It tries to rebuild lost ground. But once the heart knows where refuge is, fear finds no room to stay. It may knock, but it cannot enter. God's shield isn't something that fades. It's a promise renewed each day. His presence is like the sun still shining behind the clouds. Even when the sky darkens, the light remains. Mature faith remembers this. God is still God, even when nothing seems to happen. That memory keeps the heart steady and turns fear into remembrance. There's a peace that doesn't depend on explanations. It's born when the heart knows it's covered, when it no longer needs to feel to know. When even in vulnerability, the shield remains the same, because God doesn't change with the weather of the soul. He is the same in every season. It's in that constancy that a new kind of freedom begins. Fear stops being an enemy and becomes a reminder that there's always refuge, that there's a love that covers, that no shadow is strong enough to dim His presence. It's the kind of safety that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. And when the heart finally recognizes itself as protected, life changes tone. The storms still come, but they no longer frighten like before, because those who have found the right refuge no longer fear the sound of rain. God remains there, as He always has. And with that truth, this journey moves toward its final step, the closing reminder that fear can still be seen, but it never again needs to be followed. Fear will still exist. It will still appear on quiet days, trying to draw near when faith feels small. But now you know it can be seen, but it doesn't have to be followed. The difference isn't in eliminating fear, but in deciding who leads the way. And when God walks ahead, fear may still walk beside you, but it will never again set the direction. The word promises, "The Lord, He is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed." Deuteronomy 31:8. That's the essence of every faith journey. Never walking alone. Fear feeds on the illusion of abandonment, but faith remembers that God goes before, opening paths you haven't yet seen, preparing answers you haven't yet asked for, strengthening steps you don't yet understand. God's quiet shield doesn't disappear when the light returns. It remains steady, unseen, present. Every fear overcome becomes a memory of His faithfulness. Every tear shed in the dark becomes proof that His love is stronger than any shadow. And suddenly, what once terrified you turns into a reminder. I was protected all along. There may still be days when anxiety tries to return. That's okay. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of being human. The difference now is that you know where to rest. Faith doesn't isolate you from the world. It anchors you in something the world can't take away, the constant presence of God. It doesn't keep fear from appearing, but it keeps it from ruling over you. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture that fear before you. See it slowly fading, not because you defeated it, but because between you and it stands a shield. Christ Himself. He's the one who places Himself between what threatens you and what belongs to you. He's the one who turns weakness into refuge, silence into shelter, and darkness into hope. And if these words brought peace to your heart, hold this moment close. It's a reminder that God never left. He simply spoke in a gentler tone. And when fear returns, come back here to this same place and listen again. Because sometimes all we need is a whisper to remember that we're still being kept. The cross still stands, the light still shines, and the shield still covers. Fear can still be seen, but it never again needs to be followed. If you'd like more gentle, hope-filled reflections, subscribe. It helps this small channel reach those who need it. Let's keep walking together, one quiet moment at a time.